Okay, hi everyone. So today we're talking about 8.1 Introduction to Psychological Disorders. And your objective for today is going to be that students will be able to explain what constitutes a psychological disorder and how that plays a role in our legal system. Okay, so just like many of the other modules that we've discussed, we take a look at psychological disorders through the lens of all the modules. So we take a look at it through the biological approach. So we're thinking about biology. We look at it from the medical model, which is like a diagnose and treat. We look at it from the psychological approach or from the psychoanalytic approach, where your unconscious is going to play a role. Social cultural, where social and cultural plays a role. The biopsychosocial approach, so where we really take a look at everything. And then finally, the vulnerability stress hypothesis, or the diathesis stress hypothesis. And we're actually going to talk more about these in class, so I'm not going to go into great detail about them right now. But just make sure when we talk about them in class that you do get that information written down. So how do we figure out if somebody has a disorder? Well, that's where we have the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. And this is the 5th edition. And what this does is it helps to diagnose a psychological illness. And they take a look at 5 axes. The first is clinical syndromes. Are there any clinical syndromes present? Second, is it a personality disorder, or is there a mental retardation present? Third, general medical condition. Is there anything medically going on that we need to be aware of? Fourth, is there any psychosocial or environmental problems that we need to be aware of? And finally, what is the global assessment of this person's functioning? And this is on a scale of, well, 0 actually to 100. So can the person function? If they can function, then it may not be a disorder. If they can't function, then that might be something that we need to look into. Now, not everybody approves of the DSM, and this should actually say the DSM-5. Sorry, at one point in time it was the 4, now it's the 5. Critics of the DSM. Well, there was a study that we'll talk about in class called the Rosenhan study, and this happened in the 70s. Essentially, what they did was they placed healthy individuals in a mental institution. So what they did was these individuals complained of symptoms. They were institutionalized. Once they were institutionalized, they acted completely normal, but they were refused to let out. And were not released. And so this brought a lot of criticism down on the mental health field on what was happening inside of some of these institutions. The other part of the criticism is a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that is, if you are diagnosed, then will you have the symptoms? So will you kind of fall to in the critic's viewpoint of a trap of, oh, I'm depressed, I have depression, so now I, can't do this or that. And that might be a self-fulfilling prophecy rather than trying to kind of fight through it if you weren't diagnosed. And again, these are just critics of the DSM. It has been very helpful overall, but you should always address some of the criticisms. So, how do we know if something is technically a psychological disorder? Well, the first hospital to treat mental illness was actually in Baghdad in 705. And this was the first place for people who were considered abnormal. So this goes back to a point of time, but then the question became, well, what was abnormal? And so with the way that we look at it now is abnormal is going to be anything that would be considered a significant disturbance that leads to dysfunction. So a psychological disorder is going to be anything that could cause you to be abnormal. And the way they define abnormal is some sort of a disturbance that leads to dysfunction. And again, that they look at that on that 0 to 100 scale. Is it leading you to have a dysfunctional life? If it is, then they would consider that abnormal. If not, then you are fine. And so this abnormality or this idea of abnormality has played a role into our legal system because if somebody is acting abnormally, then should they be held accountable for their actions is the debate that people have had. And so what that has led to is what we call the insanity defense. This is not a psychological term. This is a legal term. This has been invented by the legal world as a way to explain that people who suffer or have some sort of dysfunction should not be held legally responsible for the actions that they committed. But this is not a psychological term. But another benefit that has come out of identifying what is abnormal is this idea of confidentiality and this idea that psychologists and counselors and anybody who fits into this field. So there's a lot that we could put here, but think of any sort of psychiatrist, psychologist, a counselor, anybody who may fit into that field is held to confidentiality. So what that means, they do not have to disclose private information to the legal community. Now, there is an exception to this rule. If you say that you are going to hurt yourself or if you make a threat towards others, then they do have to report that because they're considered what they call mandated reporters. So meaning if there is abuse happening or a threat to harm oneself or others, that supersedes confidentiality, and then that needs to be reported to authorities, but not necessarily to the legal community. And this is, so to sum up and to discuss, so abnormal or considering anything abnormal is going to be anything that impacts your day-to-day life. If it impacts your day-to-day life, then it's going to be considered an abnormal behavior and could lead to dysfunction. And we use the DSM-5 as a way to kind of identify specifically what might be going on. And that has allowed us to have a better understanding of exactly what people suffer from. However, it doesn't necessarily fall into the legal system. So there is this idea of the insanity defense but the insanity defense is not a psychological term. It is a legal term, but it has allowed for confidentiality between doctors and their patients.